It seems like common sense, doesn't it? When people are pushed together by a powerful shared threat, especially one that forces them out of their homes and into exile, you'd think they'd automatically form a united front. They have the same enemy, the same, well, dire circumstances. Surely that creates instant solidarity, right?
That intuitive idea, while it sounds appealing, it turns out to be far more complicated in reality. That's really the paradox we're diving into today.
Okay.
We're looking at the Russian opposition, specifically those operating from outside of Russia, often now living in, various degrees of exile across Europe and beyond. We've been given a set of sources that takes a really close look at this very challenge. Why, despite being literally pushed together by circumstances like exile and sharing a fundamental opposition to the war in Ukraine and the current regime, why they struggle so significantly to overcome their differences and form a cohesive unit.
It's particularly fascinating because, as the source material lays out, emigration isn't typically some planned, orderly thing where like-minded people move together.
Right.
It often throws together individuals and groups who, back in Russia, might have operated in completely different spheres, maybe barely even knew each other existed. You'd think this shared experience of displacement, this physical proximity in a new country, would be a powerful unifying force.
Yeah, absolutely would.
But what the sources reveal is that quite often the opposite seems to be happening. Instead of smoothing over existing differences, exile appears to be amplifying them, actively preventing the formation of, a united bloc.
Precisely. The sources suggest that simply sharing a common adversary in, a new geographical location doesn't magically erase years of differing political philosophies or strategic disagreements, or even fundamental clashes in values and lived experiences. In fact, being thrust into new, often stressful environments where they're under scrutiny from multiple directions, it seems to exacerbate these pre-existing fault lines. It leads to significant fragmentation, not cohesion.
So, our mission in this deep dive, then, is to unpack the specifics of that fragmentation. What are the actual cracks within this anti-war movement operating from abroad? We'll explore the moral, the ethical, and the pragmatic disagreements that the sources identify as causing these splits.
Yeah.
And crucially, we'll look at how these internal divisions impact their ability to function effectively, specifically, how they weaken their ability to communicate persuasively and gain support, both from Western audiences who they need for, refuge and resources, and perhaps even more critically, with those still inside Russia, whose future they ostensibly aim to represent.
It's a deeply complex picture, absolutely full of internal contradictions and external pressures.
Okay, let's unpack this core problem then, this fragmentation and exile. As we said, the situation being forced out, sharing a common difficult circumstance, it doesn't automatically lead to unity. The sources really drive home this point by highlighting specific examples.
And perhaps one of the most widely publicized examples that illustrates the challenges they face and the intense public scrutiny they are under is the incident involving the independent Russian media outlet, TV Rain, operating from Latvia.
Yes, the controversy that led to them losing their broadcast license. Could you walk us through exactly what happened there based on what the sources describe?
Certainly. The controversy erupted around a comment made by one of the channel's news anchors during a live broadcast. He expressed a hope, basically, that the channel could potentially help Russian soldiers with equipment and basic amenities at the front.
Okay.
Now, the sources explained that from the perspective of Latvia's media watchdog, this statement was seen as crossing a clear red line.
Right.
It touched upon incredibly sensitive issues related to the war and was interpreted by the authorities as, potentially offering support to the aggressor's military. This perception, feeding into existing sensitivities in a host country bordering Russia, ultimately led to the revocation of TV Rain's broadcasting license in Latvia.
And this single comment and the reaction to it, it didn't just affect TV Rain, did it? It sent ripples through the entire exile community, according to the sources.
Absolutely. The source material points out the significant reaction from other members of the Russian opposition and media figures also in exile. It describes an open letter that was quickly drafted and signed by over 130 individuals, a mix of journalists, activists, political figures.
Wow, 130.
Yeah. This letter expressed strong support for TV Rain, arguing that the channel was a vital independent voice and specifically condemned Latvia's decision to revoke the license. They framed this action as something that inadvertently aided the Kremlin's efforts to silence independent Russian media.
So the letter was an attempt to show solidarity, push back against the host country's decision, but what was the outcome, according to the sources? Did it work?
Well, The sources state clearly that the letter failed to reverse Latvia's decision regarding the license, but its impact didn't stop there. What it did do was significantly amplify public criticism, directed not just at TV Rain, but at the broader Russian anti-war diaspora in exile. The incident and the subsequent letter fueled a narrative, particularly among some of the host countries, highlighting a perceived inability within the diaspora to acknowledge or admit mistakes.
Ah, okay.
The idea that they immediately leaped to defend one of their own without sufficient self-reflection on the problematic nature of the anchor's comment, especially given the context of the war.
And this also fed into that uncomfortable feeling you mentioned earlier that some in the host countries felt their hospitality was being, overstretched?
Precisely. The sources indicate that the TV Rain incident in its fallout contributed to a sense among some in the host countries that the Russian exiles weren't fully understanding the sensitivities of their new environment and that their internal disagreements or perceived lack of humility were becoming, a public burden.
So one incident, one seemingly small comment, exposed these deep fault lines and had significant negative consequences, both legally and in terms of PR for the whole community.
It served as a stark illustration of the incredibly high-stakes environment these media and political exiles operate in.
Mm-hmm.
They're attempting to organize resistance against a powerful state from a position of, precariousness in a new country. Public perception is incredibly volatile, and even what might seem like a minor misstep or a disagreement handled poorly within the community can quickly blow up, attract negative attention, and have serious repercussions. It really underscored how their internal divisions aren't just abstract arguments, but can significantly impact their ability to operate and maintain support.
That makes a lot of sense. So the TV Rain incident is a symptom, maybe, but the sources also delve into the deeper root causes of this divergence within the Russian anti-war movement abroad. It's not just one-off mistakes or personality clashes, right?
That's correct. The source material points to fundamental disagreements that run much deeper, leading to highly emotional and often public debates, frequently played out on social media platforms, which of course only amplifies the friction.
What are these fundamental areas of disagreement that the sources identify then?
The sources highlight two main categories. First, there are the moral and ethical issues. These are incredibly challenging and touch on deeply sensitive questions.
Like the idea of collective guilt. I've seen that debated a lot.
Exactly. This involves heated debates around concepts like collective guilt, the thorny and painful question of who bears responsibility, or perhaps some level of collective responsibility for the war. Is it solely the regime? Is it the military personnel carrying out the orders? Or does some measure of responsibility extend to segments of the Russian population, either for their inaction, their silence, or maybe their quiet support? This is a hugely divisive issue.
And linked to that, the sources point to disagreements about expressing sympathy. That sounds tricky.
This is where it gets really interesting, considering the various perspectives on this deeply sensitive topic. The sources reveal significant friction within the opposition itself regarding the appropriateness of expressing any sympathy towards any Russians affected by the war.
Any Russians at all, even just civilians.
Well, on one side, there's the view that the sole focus should be on the victims of Russian aggression in Ukraine, period. And that expressing empathy for Russians, even those caught up in things like forced mobilization or facing hardship due to sanctions or the regime's repression, is inappropriate or even offensive, given the scale of suffering inflicted by the Russian state.
I can understand that perspective, certainly.
But, on the other hand, some argue that failing to show empathy for those inside Russia who are also victims of the regime's actions, people imprisoned for protest, facing economic ruin, or forced into a brutal war they don't support, that this alienates potential allies and misunderstands the complex reality inside the country. The sources show this is a major point of contention, often leading to really harsh accusations between different opposition factions.
I can absolutely see how that debate would be incredibly fraught, especially in the context of a brutal war. It pits different kinds of suffering and different ideas of responsibility against each other.
It does. And these aren't just abstract debates. They influence how people communicate, who they're willing to work with, and how they're perceived, both internally and externally.
Okay, and the second category of disagreements. You said there were two.
Second, there are the more pragmatic, practical questions. These relate directly to the how and the what next.
Like, how do you actually bring the war to an end? What's the plan?
Exactly. There are significantly divergent views on the acceptable means to stop the war. What actions are considered legitimate or effective or morally permissible from exile? Is it solely through peaceful means, public protest, information campaigns, lobbying Western governments, or are more radical or even violent methods on the table? This is a major point of strategic division.
And beyond just stopping the war, they also disagree on what comes after, assuming the regime changes.
Yes, fundamentally different plans and visions for the future rebuilding of Russia after the conflict ends or the regime changes. How do you even begin to agree on a roadmap for a post-Putin Russia when people have wildly different ideas about its structure, its relationship with its neighbors, its historical legacy, its core values? The sources suggest that this lack of a shared, detailed vision for the future makes it incredibly difficult to unite on present-day actions.
How do you even begin to agree on a roadmap when starting points and desired futures are so different? It sounds like they can broadly agree that the current system is unacceptable, but anything beyond that immediately leads to conflict.
That lack of agreement on both the tactical path and the ultimate destination is a significant engine of the fragmentation the sources describe. It really is.
Let's dig deeper into those specific fault lines the sources identify within the opposition abroad then. You mentioned a generational gap as one of the key divides.
Yes, and the sources highlight that this particular fracture became acutely visible almost immediately after the full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022.
Right after the invasion.
Exactly. As a new wave of predominantly younger activists, journalists, IT specialists fled Russia to escape escalating repression and the war, they landed in exile and encountered existing, often long-established circles of older, predominantly male Russian intellectuals who'd been living abroad for years, maybe even decades.
So you have this collision between the established diaspora and this new influx of younger, often more digitally savvy arrivals. A bit of a culture clash, maybe.
Exactly. The older generation often had already cultivated social capital and visibility in Europe, having built reputations and networks over their long-term residence outside Russia. But the sources note that while it might be tempting to frame this simply as a clash of generations, the criticisms leveled by the younger activists ran deeper than just age or arrival date.
Okay, what were the specific points of criticism coming from the younger generation towards these older established circles?
Well, the younger activists criticized these older, often male-dominated circles for what they perceived as exclusivism, a reluctance to genuinely include newcomers or, share platforms. They also noted a perceived lack of critical self-reflection on the part of the older generation, suggesting they struggle to adapt their understanding to the new, harsher realities inside Russia, or to acknowledge past failures or blind spots. And critically, the sources highlight accusations of sexism. The source material mentions a specific example involving the feminist activist Loja Nordic and the Prague-based journalist and intellectual Alexander Morozov to illustrate this point.
Okay.
Suggesting that instances of dismissiveness or patriarchal attitudes were perceived by the younger generation, particularly women, as a significant barrier and a reflection of deeper issues within some established figures.
So it wasn't just about who was here first, but also about established power dynamics, resistance to change, and what was perceived as entrenched, even if unintentional, discriminatory attitudes. That makes sense.
And the sources make a crucial connection here, linking this generational gap within the exile community back to the differing levels of war support and political views inside Russia.
How so?
Well, support for the current regime and the war is notably higher among older generations in Russia, who tend to rely more on state media, right? While opposition is generally stronger among urban youth, who have more access to alternative information and have grown up with different social norms.
Right.
The younger exiles, having often been part of that urban anti-war youth movement, carry those experiences and perspectives with them. They advocate for a more radical break with the dominant norms, discourse, and even the symbols of the past. They feel that established opposition platforms and figures, often rooted in older Soviet-era dissident or maybe 1990s liberal frameworks, struggle to adapt to the current political landscape and the mindset of younger Russians.
It's like trying to use an old map to navigate completely new territory, isn't it? The older structures and ways of thinking aren't necessarily equipped for the challenges or perspectives of 2022 onwards.
Precisely. That's a good way to put it. The sources mention the youth platform Doxa as an example that contrasts with some of the more established opposition platforms, suggesting different approaches to media and activism that resonate more with the younger generation are emerging.
Okay. Now, another critical fault line highlighted is gender, specifically the role and visibility of feminist anti-war resistance. The sources point out that the younger generation fleeing Russia has a heightened awareness of the immense gender imbalance in Russia.
Yes, and the source material provides a really concrete example that starkly illustrates how this lack of awareness or sensitivity to gender issues can manifest even within supposedly liberal or progressive Russian opposition circles operating abroad.
What was the example?
They point to a conversation hosted by prominent Russian oppositional media with the Ukrainian president back in March of 2022, a really high-profile event.
Okay, I think I remember hearing about that.
The sources note the complete absence of female interviewers in this interaction. And they highlight how the subsequent responses from the event's organizers, when this was pointed out, further revealed a significant insensitivity to gender issues within their own ranks. It was a moment that underlined for many that even within the opposition, patriarchal norms were still deeply ingrained.
That seems like such a basic oversight, but one that, as you say, speaks volumes about underlying attitudes, especially for a group claiming to represent a better future.
It does. And the sources also provide valuable historical context here, explaining that before the war, feminist activism in Russia was often marginalized and dismissed by mainstream political figures. It was frequently characterized unfairly as fringe, or even caricatured as aggressively anti-male.
Right, that trope.
Exactly. However, since the full-scale invasion on February 24th, there's been a significant and undeniable shift. More voices are explicitly connecting previously disparate issues. Things like the prevalence of legalized domestic violence in Russia, the brutal and often indiscriminate practices of mobilization that disproportionately impact certain groups, and the horrific reports of war crimes committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine, which tragically often involve sexual violence.
So the war has forced a recognition, maybe, that these issues aren't separate, that they're interconnected parts of a larger problem of violence and state control.
Absolutely. The sources show how this perspective has gained traction, particularly among younger activists. And here's a really significant observation the sources highlight. Despite the historical dismissal and the ongoing challenges in gaining full recognition, the most prominent, and according to the sources, successful anti-war grassroots organization operating today is, in fact, headed by Russian feminists.
Wow. That is a significant detail.
It suggests that while the established, visible political figures in exile grapple with fragmentation and internal disagreements, highly effective organizing is happening at a decentralized, grassroots level, often led by individuals and groups who were previously on the political fringes. This really challenges the conventional idea of where effective resistance comes from.
That is a powerful point and a crucial insight from the sources. Moving on, the sources also identify the issue of ethnic minorities as another key divide, splitting the émigré communities and the broader Russian anti-war movement.
Yeah. This touches upon a deeply rooted and painful history within Russia itself. Ethnic minorities have historically been victims of aggressive Russian centralization policies and imperial expansion, suffering discrimination and suppression of their languages and cultures for centuries.
And how has that historical context played out in the specific environment of exile and the current war? It sounds like a recipe for more tension.
Well, the sources point to a particularly problematic situation where, in the context of the war, some within the dominant Russian narrative, even sometimes coming from the liberal opposition, have, perhaps implicitly or explicitly, called ethnic minorities to carry the blame for the Kremlin's actions in Ukraine.
Wow. Blaming the victims of imperialism for the empire's actions.
It adds this layer of unfair burden onto communities who have themselves been historically oppressed by the very state system they are now being asked to answer for. Compounding this, the sources describe how some initial reactions from certain prominent Russian opposition leaders showed little willingness or interest in sharing platforms or collaborating on equal footing with representatives of these ethnic minorities communities who've been perpetually marginalized and discriminated against by the Russian state. Reactions to a meeting held in May 2022 by the Free Russia Forum are cited as an example of this initial sidelining, where ethnic minority voices really struggled to gain equal prominence.
And the sources say the situation even got uglier. How so?
Yes, unfortunately. The sources state that things took a more disturbing turn when a few individuals attempted to shift blame for the brutalities committed during the war specifically onto ethnic minorities. This was based on early, often incomplete data suggesting that a large share of those fighting on the Russian side in the initial stages were ethnically non-Russian, often from poorer regions.
Okay, I've heard that argument.
The deeply problematic implication, as presented by some, was to somehow attribute the violence and war crimes to their ethnic or regional background, rather than to the state that mobilized, trained, and directed them.
Which, as you say, is a deeply problematic and discriminatory line of reasoning that echoes historical prejudices. It deflects responsibility from the system itself.
Absolutely. The underlying issue here, as analyzed in the source material, is that this sidelining, the reluctance to share platforms and these attempts to shift blame, suggests that even among some vocal opponents of the current regime in the war, there is an inability, perhaps subconscious, to fully free themselves from imperial consciousness. And Prisco Soznani.
Imperial consciousness. Can you unpack that a bit?
It's a complex term, but essentially it refers to a mindset where ethnic minorities aren't seen as equal subjects with their own distinct histories and rights, but are viewed through a hierarchical, paternalistic, or even proprietary lens by members of the dominant Russian ethnic group. This historical imperial mindset, deeply embedded by centuries of empire, persists and complicates efforts to build a truly inclusive opposition, even in exile.
So, in a painful irony, the very thing they're supposedly fighting against, the imperial mindset driving the aggression in Ukraine, is in some ways still present within their own ranks, hindering unity with other oppressed groups from Russia.
That's the concern raised in the sources. As a result of this struggle for recognition and equal footing, a significant portion of the anti-war movement originating from ethnic minority communities has been drawn to alternative, more inclusive platforms.
Like which ones?
The Free Nations of Russia Forum, or the League of Free Nations, are mentioned as prominent examples. These platforms explicitly center the voices and experiences of activists from Russia's ethnic minority regions, focusing on indigenous activists. The sources note that these platforms have gained considerable traction and visibility.
Okay, so they're creating their own spaces. But even within these alternative platforms focusing on ethnic minorities, the sources note there are new disagreements emerging. Correct. It's not like they all agree either.
Yes, that's right. Even among minority representatives themselves, there's no unanimity, particularly regarding the fundamental question of Russia's future structure. For instance, the sources contrast the position taken by groups like Free Borussia, which advocates for keeping Russia as a federation, but significantly modernizing it and ensuring real regional autonomy,
Okay, reforming the existing structure.
with the stance of groups like the Free Nations of Russia Forum, which insists on the complete emancipation of ethnic minorities through the creation of fully independent republics.
Huh?
Total breakup.
So, even after creating their own spaces focused on minority rights, fundamental disagreements about the ultimate political structure of the territory they come from continue to divide them. It's not a monolithic bloc even within these communities.
Not at all. And the sources also point to the complex issue of legitimacy for these minority advocates. The sources note that none of these individuals or groups have been officially endorsed through democratic processes to definitively speak on behalf of an entire given minority community. They represent segments, important ones perhaps, but cannot claim to be the sole undisputed voice.
Which raises a crucial and delicate question, doesn't it? Especially given the external gaze from host countries and international media, who might be watching and perhaps expecting a clear, unified message, maybe even expecting what might be labeled separatist nationalism.
Exactly. The sources pose this very question. How can advocates genuinely represent the diverse interests and experiences of Russia's ethnic minorities accurately and fairly without essentializing them, without reducing complex communities to a single viewpoint, especially when navigating external perceptions and potential stereotypes? It's a constant challenge in gaining both internal buy-in from their own communities and external credibility with international audiences.
Wow. Okay, so beyond the generational, gender, and ethnic divides, the sources also point to a lack of unanimity regarding the fundamental goals and strategies for political action. It's not just about who they are or where they come from, but what they believe needs to be done and how to do it.
Exactly. There's no consensus on the very nature and objectives of the political action required to end the war and bring about regime change. The sources suggest that the possibility for fruitful collaboration among some key parts of the opposition was significantly diminished following a specific incident last May.
What was that incident that caused such a rift?
It occurred at the second anti-war conference held in May 2022. At that time, there was considerable debate and consideration by European authorities regarding the possibility of implementing widespread visa bans for Russian citizens in response to the war.
Ray, I remember those discussions.
In this context, the organizers of this particular conference put forward a proposal to introduce what they called a good Russian passports.
A good Russian passports. That phrase immediately sounds, well, highly controversial and potentially divisive.
It certainly did, according to the sources. The idea behind it was to create a mechanism to distinguish Russians who had publicly spoken out against the war, perhaps signed petitions, participated in protests, or made public declarations from those who hadn't. The proposal was that this distinction, certified somehow, could allow those who had publicly opposed the war to retain certain privileges in Europe, like easier visa access, at a time when restrictions were being considered for all Russian citizens.
Okay. And how is this idea received, particularly by those still inside Russia or who had only recently left, I can imagine?
As you can imagine, it generated significant and often furious criticism, according to the sources. Many, particularly those who had recently fled or still had family inside Russia, accused the long-term émigrés who proposed the idea of being fundamentally out of touch with realities in Russia.
Yeah.
They argued that it was easy for people living in relative safety abroad to demand public statements against the war, but incredibly dangerous for those still inside the country, facing severe penalties, job loss, or threats to their families if they spoke out openly.
That gets directly back to that profound question of legitimacy we touched on earlier. Who has the right to speak for or set conditions for those facing a completely different reality inside Russia?
It does, and this incident starkly highlighted that disconnect. Furthermore, the sources point out that key figures and groups within the Russian opposition abroad advocate for drastically different programs and methods of action. This includes figures like exiled businessman Mikhail Khodorkovsky, former State Duma Deputy Dmitry Gudkov, activist and former MP Ilya Ponomarev, and the network of supporters of imprisoned opposition leader Alexei Navalny operating from abroad, led by figures like Leonid Volkov and Ivan Zhdanov.
A lot of different names and groups there.
And the sources state that the existence of these distinct and often conflicting programs further splinters the already unstable anti-war base in exile.
Do these different groups at least share the same ultimate goal for Russia? Is there any common ground there?
The sources indicate that, generally speaking, yes, they share a broad end goal. Transforming Russia into a European-style parliamentary democracy, crucially one without the kind of strong, centralized presidential power that the current system embodies.
Okay, so the end point is similar.
Broadly, yes. However, the profound disagreement lies in the strategies and tactics they believe are necessary or even permissible to achieve this.
Okay, let's break down the different strategic approaches mentioned in the sources then. What are the main camps?
First, the sources highlight the approach advocated by Ilya Ponomarev. He is described as advocating for violent methods of resistance against the regime. The source states that Ponomarev has been arguably cooperating with the National Republican Army, or NRA.
The NRA. I remember that name coming up in connection with the assassination of Daria Dugana, wasn't it?
That's correct. The sources note that the NRA publicly claimed responsibility for the assassination of Daria Dugina, the daughter of ultranationalist Alexander Dugin, in August 2022.
Right.
However, the source material also immediately raises significant questions about the NRA itself and Ponomarev's alleged ties to it. The sources question whether the NRA really exists as a genuine independent underground group or if it is something else entirely. They also raise questions about the extent to which Ponomarev has genuinely distanced himself from the Russian elites and power structures he was previously a part of. So even this seemingly clear strategic path is shrouded in questions about its authenticity and true nature.
That adds a layer of uncertainty to that whole approach,
Lots.
definitely. What about a different path? Who else is proposing what?
Well, on a contrasting path, the sources describe the strategy pursued by Alexei Navalny's key supporters in exile, namely Leonid Volkov and Ivan Zhdanov. They are described as betting on building a partisan underground network inside Russia. They announced the creation of this new network of activists within Russia in October 2022.
A partisan underground, and their approach is fundamentally different from advocating for violent resistance.
Yes, significantly different. The sources characterize Volkov and Zhdanov's approach as much more wary of violent action. Instead, they advocate for identifying and bringing together existing grassroots activists already engaged in various forms of quiet opposition or support work inside Russia. People involved in humanitarian aid for those affected by the war, helping those fleeing the mobilization or participating in clandestine anti-war protest that avoids overt confrontation with the authorities. The goal is to build a decentralized network of quiet resistance.
How was this call to form a network received by the grassroots activists inside Russia or those recently fled? Did they jump on board?
The reactions, according to the source material, were rather critical and cautious. Volkov and Zdanov faced criticism for a perceived lack of prior communication or consultation with the very grassroots organizations and activists they were proposing to unite.
Ah.
Especially given that Volkov and Zdanov had been living abroad for some time before this initiative was launched. There were also significant concerns raised about the security risks associated with sharing personal information within this new proposed network.
Understandable.
Particularly in light of past incidents where personal data of Navalny supporters have been leaked, leading to harassment and persecution by Russian authorities.
Understandably cautious, yeah, given the draconian environment inside Russia and past experiences. That makes sense. Are there other major strategic approaches?
Finally, the sources mentioned the Congress of Free Russia, an initiative associated with figures like Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Dmitry Gudkov. This group held a significant gathering in Vilnius, Lithuania, at the end of August and early September 2022. The sources describe this event as offering a platform and a space for what are characterized as peace-seeking discussions among various opposition figures and intellectuals.
Okay, peace-seeking discussions. And what was the tangible outcome of these discussions, according to the sources? Did they agree on anything?
Well, the source material explicitly states that despite being a three-day event intended to bring people together for dialogue, the meeting in Vilnius did not lead to any practical decisions.
No practical decisions. So conversations happen, perhaps valuable ones, but no concrete steps forward emerge from that particular gathering.
Exactly. And the sources note that as time passes, this pattern of strategic fragmentation and lack of concrete unified progress across these various initiatives, well, it diminishes the credibility of Russian political exiles in being able to create a viable challenge to Putin's regime.
Credibility in whose eyes?
In the eyes of both external observers, like Western governments perhaps, and potentially those still inside Russia. When potential allies look at the opposition abroad, they see multiple, sometimes conflicting strategies and a difficulty in uniting, which weakens the perception of their potential effectiveness.
This leads us directly to another significant and inherent challenge highlighted in the sources, the exile's predicament itself. It's not just about being in a different country. The sources frame it as a specific state of being, a difficult condition.
It is, and the sources articulate a profound and central question that hangs over the entire anti-war movement operating from abroad. Do the exiles truly have the right to represent and speak for those still in Russia, the vast majority of the population often referred to as the Remainers?
That feels like the core tension underpinning so many of these issues we've discussed. They are physically removed, often in safer environments, but how do they maintain a genuine connection, a source of legitimate information, and a claim to speak for people who are facing a completely different, much harsher reality inside the country, under direct repression and propaganda?
Exactly. And this fundamental struggle with legitimacy directly impacts the anti-war movement's effectiveness in Europe. It makes it incredibly difficult to maintain consistent support, political presence, and perceived relevance with those who remain inside Russia, especially when the movement abroad is already so fragmented and visibly disagreeing on basic issues. The physical distance and the vastly differing realities of life inside and outside Russia create an inherent disconnect that is just incredibly hard to bridge.
The source material mentions the tangible consequences of relocation too, like the loss of social capital. What does that mean in practice?
Yes. Political scientist Ekaterina Shulman is cited in the source context for her commentary on this. When you are forced into exile, you don't just leave behind your home. You leave behind your established networks, your professional contacts, your familiarity with the local landscape, the personal relationships that gave you influence, credibility, or a platform back home.
Right, everything that made you effective there.
Precisely. You arrive in a new country where you have to start building all of that again from scratch, often in a different language and cultural context, while still trying to influence events happening thousands of miles away in your homeland. Rebuilding that social capital is an immense task, and its loss weakens your ability to act effectively.
And then adding to that difficulty, the sources point to deliberate efforts to undermine them, smear campaigns from Russia.
Yeah, the sources note that exiles aren't just facing the passive challenge of rebuilding their lives and networks. They have to actively contend with being targeted by propaganda and smear campaigns, often orchestrated from Russia, designed to make them look like traitors to their homeland. The sources use the experience of the renowned actress and philanthropist Chulpan Kamatova as a powerful example. After her emigration and vocal stance against the war, she faced a wave of intense public hatred and condemnation from pro-regime elements and state media back in Russia.
That must be incredibly difficult to deal with personally, aside from the political implications.
Absolutely. This is a constant pressure, not just the loss of potential support, but facing active hostility and demonization from segments of the population back home, which further erodes their potential legitimacy in the eyes of those inside the country.
Given these immense issues of legitimacy, the ethical complexities we discussed, and the difficulty in maintaining access to reliable first-hand information from inside Russia, it makes sense that some groups might decide that direct, high-level political action from exile isn't the most effective path, maybe, that they choose a different focus.
And the sources observe that this is precisely what is happening with some parts of the anti-war movement in exile. Recognizing the challenges inherent in claiming to politically represent people inside Russia from abroad, some groups and initiatives are explicitly refusing to engage in overt, high-level political strategizing or claiming to speak for the entire nation.
So what are they doing instead?
Instead, they're focusing their efforts on more tangible grassroots support for those directly affected by the war's consequences on the ground. This includes providing humanitarian aid to Ukrainian refugees who ended up in Russia, helping Russians fleeing the draft or facing prosecution for their anti-war activities, or supporting independent media projects focused on providing information to Russia.
So a shift from macro-political maneuvering to micro-level humanitarian and informational support. That sounds very practical.
Yes, a more grounded, less politically ambitious, but perhaps more immediately impactful approach. The sources highlight a conference held in Berlin in December 2022 as an example of this trend. This event specifically brought together grassroots anti-war initiatives operating in various countries.
Okay.
Crucially, the organizers openly acknowledged the existing diversity of political views among the participants. Instead of trying to force a single platform or grand strategy, they deliberately adopted a horizontal conversation format.
Horizontal conversation format.
Yeah, the primary goal was experience exchange, allowing different initiatives to share what was working and what wasn't, rather than attempting to formulate a unified political action program or declare who the leaders were.
That sounds like a pragmatic way to bypass some of the leadership disagreements and focus on shared challenges and practical support. It seems better suited to the reality of fragmentation we've been talking about.
It reflects a recognition that perhaps a centralized top-down opposition structure is not feasible or even desirable in exile. This state of living in this kind of professional, political, and often personal limbo brings us to the concept the source material describes as problematic in-betweenness.
In-betweenness. What exactly does that term capture in this context? It sounds uncomfortable.
It describes the precarious state of many Russian exiles. They are unable to fully settle down or strike root, as the source says, in their new host countries. Their legal status might be temporary, their professional qualifications might not be recognized, and they often live with the hope or intention of returning to Russia someday, meaning they don't fully invest in integrating into their new society.
Okay.
At the same time, the political situation makes a return home impossible or incredibly dangerous in the foreseeable future. So they are effectively stuck in a state of suspension, not fully belonging anywhere. They are in between.
And the sources say this state of in-betweenness is especially precarious for grassroots activists. Why them in particular?
Yes, because grassroots activism often requires deep connections and trust, both with the local community, where they are based, and with people on the ground inside Russia. This in-betweenness weakens ties in both directions. They aren't fully rooted abroad to build strong local support networks, and their connection to the realities inside Russia becomes more tenuous the longer they are away. This leaves them particularly vulnerable and means they face intense pressures from multiple sides simultaneously.
Okay, let's talk about those pressures. What are the external forces the exiles are having to navigate from this already difficult in-between state?
The sources detail significant and varied external pressures. First, there is considerable pressure from the host countries that have provided refuge. These countries, understandably, require the exiles to prove their adequacy, meaning demonstrate that they are law-abiding, contributing members of society, and that they pose no security risk.
And the host countries have their own concerns, naturally, given the geopolitical context. It's not just about hospitality.
Absolutely. The sources note that host countries have not without ground fears regarding the growing influence of the Russian-speaking population that has suddenly arrived. This isn't necessarily about the opposition itself, but the general increase in Russian speakers, which raises concerns about potential influence operations, cultural integration challenges, and security. This context means the anti-war exiles are under increased scrutiny, having to constantly prove they're distinct from and actively opposing the state they fled.
Right.
Furthermore, the sources highlight a concerning trend. Even existing Russia-friendly initiatives in Europe that are primarily cultural or educational, which might have previously offered avenues for soft power or cultural exchange, are now often reluctant to collaborate with the overt anti-war movement.
Why would cultural initiatives avoid the anti-war movement? You'd think they might be natural allies in presenting a different face of Russia.
According to the sources, it's because any association with Russia has become toxic and risks provoking a public backlash. In the current climate, for any initiative operating in Europe, being publicly linked to anything Russian, even something explicitly anti-war, can trigger negative public reactions or protests.
Wow.
So, to avoid this, cultural or educational groups often choose to distance themselves entirely, which further isolates the anti-war movement and closes potential avenues for engagement and support within Europe.
That's a difficult catch-22 for the exiles. They need support abroad, but their very identity makes potential allies wary. That's tough.
It is, and then compounding all of this, there's a relentless pressure from the Kremlin itself. Even when physically outside of Russia, the activists and independent media operating from abroad continue to live in fear of the Kremlin's long hand.
How does the Kremlin exert pressure on people who have left the country? It's not like they can arrest them easily.
Well, the sources explain that this pressure manifests in several ways. Many exiles still harbor hope of returning to a changed Russia one day, where they worry deeply about the safety and well-being of family members who remain behind.
Ah, the families.
Exactly. They also might have financial assets, property, or other connections in Russia that are vulnerable. This vulnerability creates leverage for the state. Furthermore, the Kremlin actively uses legal tools to target them. Exile activists often feel compelled to adhere to Russia's draconian foreign agent law, even if they are physically outside the country, because failing to do so can lead to legal cases back home that impact their ability to return or even potentially target their relatives.
What does this foreign agent law actually require of them? I hear about it constantly.
The sources detail the requirements, and they are designed to be incredibly burdensome. Individuals and organizations designated as foreign agents by the Russian state must label everything they publish: articles, social media posts, videos with a lengthy disclaimer stating their status. Everything. They are also required to file incredibly detailed regular financial statements and activity reports with the Russian Ministry of Justice and undergo annual audits by Russian firms.
That sounds like an immense bureaucratic and financial burden, especially for small, maybe volunteer-run initiatives operating in a foreign country on tight budgets.
It is. The sources emphasize this point for independent media or grassroots NGOs, often running on limited budgets and volunteer power. The administrative and financial burden of complying with these requirements is crippling, and the list of individuals and entities designated as foreign agents is continuously growing. The sources mentioned that in November 2022, there were suggestions circulating to add another 30 anti-war NGOs operating from abroad to this list, further extending the state's reach.
So the state is actively using this legal framework to hound and burden opposition figures even when they're in exile. It's a form of remote control.
Precisely. For these NGOs and individual activists, inclusion on the list means not only significant increased bureaucratic and financial burdens, but as the sources note, it also causes significant psychological distress. Living under that kind of constant surveillance, administrative pressure, and the knowledge that the state is still actively trying to control or hinder your activities, even from thousands of miles away, is incredibly draining and adds to the precariousness of the in-between state we talked about.
So, to bring this all together, the picture painted by the sources is one of deep, multi-layered challenges for the Russian anti-war opposition operating from outside Russia. It's quite bleak in some ways.
That's an accurate summary. What we learn is that Russian exiles and anti-war activists are not a single unified bloc. They are demonstrably fragmented along significant lines: political differences regarding strategy and future vision, deep-seated ethnic and gender-based divisions that reflect historical inequalities, and a generational gap between established exiles and new arrivals. And on top of these internal divisions, they are under intense pressure and continuous scrutiny from numerous external directions simultaneously.
Whom are these external pressures coming again? Just to recap.
Well, from fellow Russians, both those still in exile, leading to internal feuds, and crucially, those remaining back home, whose judgment on legitimacy and tactical choices matters immensely. They face pressure from Ukrainians, who are the primary victims.
It sounds like they are constantly walking a tightrope, or perhaps navigating a minefield seems more apt.
The sources use similar phrasing, stating they have to walk a thin line when expressing their position. This means carefully calibrating their message to avoid alienating potential audiences at home who might be sympathetic to the anti-war cause, but deeply hesitant to support radical positions or risk their own safety. At the same time, they must navigate the sensitivities and legal frameworks of their host countries to avoid causing public backlash or facing fines and legal trouble, like the TV Rain example illustrated so starkly.
Are there any signs of resilience or positive developments mentioned in the sources amidst all this fragmentation and pressure? Is it all just struggle?
The sources do acknowledge some signs of adaptation and resilience. They mention that parts of the opposition in exile have shown a capacity for learning from mistakes made, particularly perhaps in the chaotic early months of the war. The sources also highlight that grassroots action, focusing on tangible support rather than high-level politics, is continuously evolving and proving effective in some ways. This kind of organizing often takes more ad hoc, decentralized forms without relying on formal, centralized leadership structures.
Which might make them more resilient.
Exactly, which might make them more resilient to fragmentation and external pressure compared to traditional political organizations.
So perhaps the most effective resistance is happening at a different, less visible level than the big-name figures arguing online.
Possibly. However, the sources also temper this with the significant toll being taken. The dragging war, which has lasted much longer than many initially anticipated, weighs heavily on everyone, particularly those who hoped for a quick resolution that might allow them to return home. Engaging in public activity from exile carries increasing perils due to the constant pressures we've discussed. And inevitably, as time passes, ties with Russia with the people, the shifting culture, and the daily reality on the ground inevitably weaken, exacerbating the fundamental challenge of remaining relevant and legitimate in the eyes of those inside the country.
Which brings us back to that core, seemingly intractable problem of legitimacy and connection when operating from a state of exile. It keeps coming up.
It all circles back. Despite the shared fundamental goal of opposing the current regime and ending the war, the sources make it abundantly clear that the path towards forging a truly united, effective Russian opposition operating from exile remains incredibly fraught with deep-seated internal divisions and relentless multi-directional external pressures. It is a profoundly difficult position with no easy answers, and the fragmentation isn't just a minor inconvenience. It significantly undermines their potential impact.
It's a powerful and often difficult picture to absorb. We've gone through the specific sources of fragmentation within the Russian opposition abroad, the splits along generational lines, the deep and often overlooked ethnic and gender-based divisions, and the starkly different ideas about strategy and goals. We've also explored the inherent challenges of simply being in a state of exile, from losing essential social capital and navigating that in-betweenness to facing deliberate smear campaigns from back home. And finally, we've looked at the intense and varied pressures they face, both from host countries adjusting to a new reality and from the long, persistent reach of the Kremlin, using tools like the foreign agent law to burden and control them.
It truly is a powerful reminder of how complex political movements become and how existing societal fault lines can be exposed and even exacerbated when individuals are forced out of their original context and subjected to such diverse pressures.
It makes you think about the nature of political change itself, how difficult it is to organize and maintain momentum even against a universally condemned adversary, when internal differences and external circumstances conspire against unity.
This raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. Think about how external circumstances as extreme as forced emigration don't necessarily create unity through shared hardship, but can instead act as a powerful catalyst, amplifying existing societal and ideological fault lines that were perhaps less visible before. What does that tell us about the fundamental challenges of building consensus and collective action, both from within a restrictive system and from outside it, when those operating from exile are cut off from the very people they seek to liberate or represent?
What does this all mean for the potential for change, both from within Russia and from the tireless but fragmented efforts of those who have left? It's certainly a lot to mull over.